Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode of Dis Affamie History Podcast, host Wendy Aris is joined by Professor Karl Offen, a historical geographer whose work explores indigenous histories, colonial encounters, and the making of place in Central America and the Caribbean. Together, they discuss his article, The Sambo and Tawira Miskito, the colonial origins and geography of intra-Miskito differentiation in eastern Nicaragua and Honduras. This conversation examines who the Miskito people are, how colonial powers and missionaries shaped internal divisions, and the ways race, geography, and language influenced the emergence of distinct Miskito identities. Professor Offen also unpacks the archival sources behind this research and highlights how the Miskito have preserved their cultural heritage despite centuries of colonial disruption. It's a powerful discussion on indigenous resilience, colonial legacies, and the importance of understanding history through place, movement, and memory. So let's have a listen and enjoy the episode.
Professor Offen, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to be able to speak about your article about the Miskito people in Nicaragua and the two subgroups within that. So, but before we start, can I just have you please just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah. Hi, Wendy. Thanks for inviting me. My name's Karl Offen. I'm a historical geographer by training. I'm a professor at Syracuse University. My background is a bit eclectic in terms of academic training, but for the last 30 years, I've been working on the historical geography of the Miskito people, and particularly their interactions with the British and Spanish colonial empires.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And we'll start off with, who are the Miskito people, and how would you be able to describe their cultural identity and, of course, their historical presence in Central America?
Yeah, good question. The Miskito are an Afro-Amerindian people of mixed heritage and background. There's also a lot of European background in many Miskito people, as well as some more recent 19th and 20th century immigrants to the region, including Hispanic people from the Pacific, as well as Chinese, and who formed a big part of the so-called enclave economies that took root in eastern Nicaragua and Honduras in the 19th century, mostly in the 20th century, though, with regards to the Chinese. They're one of the largest indigenous peoples in Central America today by people who self-identify as Miskito. I've seen lots of estimates. There haven't been too many recent censuses, at least on the Nicaraguan side. I think Honduras has done a little bit better. But now I would say they're kind of a diasporic people as well. Well, I was going to mention to tell your listeners that, there's a huge community of Miskito people in Port Arthur, Texas, as well as one in, I don't know if they're in Miami, but they're in South Florida. And this is all related to historical connections to what the Miskito would call company time. Which you can guess that's a corruption of company time, when the companies were very prominent on the east coast of Nicaragua and Honduras, mostly in lumber, mining, sawmills, and things like this. And a lot of the Miskito people basically managed to come to the United States during that time. And frankly, I don't know about their legal status. I assume most are naturalized or have green cards or something like that.
No, definitely. And then additionally, for the listeners who may be unfamiliar with the region, where are the Miskito located today? Like, I know you mentioned
today. Today they're basically located in what would be called the Mosquitia region of Honduras, and Nicaragua. So this would encapsulate almost the entire northeast of Honduras. There's a department, like a department of Honduras called the Mosquitia. And then eastern Nicaragua is a strong location for where many Miskito live in Nicaragua, particularly in the northeast has been the Miskito stronghold historically. Many have moved further south over time into Bluefields and areas down there, but historically they primarily lived north of Bluefields between Bluefields, Nicaragua, and Cape Cameroon. Yeah, Cameroon in Honduras.
Okay. No, perfect. Thank you so much for that. And how are the Mesquite people? Like, how would you describe their cultural identity and, of course, their historical presence in Central America?
That's a loaded question. Their cultural identity, I think, is a bit challenging because it's quite mixed. There's a lot of regional variations, and got questions here on language. There are some dialect differences. I would say a lot of their shared identity is based around, it's a matrilineal society, so very strongly based on the Miskito language as the key identity marker. This is why you have people who look quite different who will identify as Miskito, and it's because they were raised Miskito, speaking Miskito, and many are bi or trilingual now, but they grew up, with their first language being Miskito for the most part. Historically, the Miskito cultural identity, I think, has been shaped by, well, on the one hand, where they live, their environmental conditions are incentivize and reward good hunting skills. For example, turtle fishing, green turtles are a big part of Miskito identity, green sea turtles. Hunting, I mean, agriculture is now more prominent, but it wasn't something that was big in the 18th century, at least in terms of overall caloric intake. It provided a backdrop for times of hunger, maybe. But one thing about the Miskito is they've been a kind of persecuted people. The Spanish had conflictual relations with them, and the British tried to manipulate them to do their bidding, but the Miskito always remained independent. And although they took advantage of what some of these imperial powers wanted from them to get what they wanted, I would say a lot of their cultural identity, at least historically, has been shaped by external factors that they've reacted against and used to, not used, but that they've had to overcome differences among themselves to remain a viable ethnic group, to push back against colonial forces that tried to subjugate's not the right word, but basically colonize them or incorporate them into their own imperial systems. Things changed quite radically for most Miskito in the 19th century. I don't know if you want to talk about that at a separate time, but
Yeah, we'll get to that. I have a question on that specifically.
yeah.
But I know that your article did discuss two distinct groups within the Mosquito, the Sambo and the Tawira.
Yeah.
How do these two groups form historically?
Well, there's a kind of mythical version, and then there's a little bit more historically grounded scenario, but they're both related to the arrival of African peoples, people escaping slavery, either self-liberating, meaning they escaped capsized slave ship. That's kind of the mythical one. The more historically grounded is that two ships were taken by Dutch pirates, who the Spaniards considered pirates, and the Dutch sold some of the enslaved Africans to Providence Island Puritans off the coast of Nicaragua. This is the so-called other Puritan colony, contemporaneous to the one in North America, but very poorly known outside of Caribbean, Central American experts. But anyway, there were Puritan English colonists on Providence Island, which is closely related to Nicaragua's coast. They sold some to those settlers, but many of them they quote set down on the Miskito shore. And those people, this is where it gets a little, we don't really know. They became incorporated into Miskito society, and how that came about exactly is not clear. But one thing is that the majority of people of African peoples originally who mixed with the Miskito remained in the northern part of the Mosquitia, which would be the Honduras, and then just south of the Rio Coco into what is today northeastern Nicaragua, and that became sort of the heartland of the Zambo mosquito. And that term comes from both the Spanish and the English. It's spelled differently in Spanish with a Z and with a S in English, but it basically means offspring of African peoples and Native Americans. It's kind of that term is used broadly in the Americas, but in this context, it is specifically referred to Miskito people who are of mixed heritage. Meanwhile, the Tawira is a Miskito word that means long hair or full hair, and it was a term I used taken from a 19th century source that referred to them as Tawira. It's not a term in wide use today. And Sambo isn't either, for that matter, for obvious reasons. It's just simply the Miskito, and the Miskito they self-designate as we are Miskito Indians. They don't like the word people. Many don't really think of themselves as mixed race in any way. They're an indigenous people. I like to think of them, I think a good scholarly middle ground on this is a mixed race indigenous people, because they are indigenous to this area, but with ancestry that's transatlantic in many respects.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And especially with the word Sambo, yes, the British definitely did use that and still had it kind of as their classification of individuals based on how much either African or British or European ancestry that a person had. So we're going to go back to missionaries. So, what role did the missionaries play in shaping the Mosquito Society identity and, of course, social divisions?
Yeah, this is a very good topic. First of all, given that the Miskito were independents during the long colonial period, and I say long because independence of Spanish Central America initially had very little impact on the Miskito because they were basically on the edge of Central America, what's called the Caribbean edge. You know, they didn't feel any different with the relationship with independence. A bigger momentous change for them was when the British were forced to evacuate from the Mosquito shore in an agreement with the Spanish at the end of the 18th century. And they were kind of left on their own. And the Spaniards, before there became an independence movement, were kind of inadequate in dealing with the Mosquito, either trying to appease them or incorporate them or subjugate them in some way. They miserably failed in that effort, part because of Miskito's strength and Miskito's skills at diplomacy, and their basically being accustomed to dealing with foreign diplomatic arrangements, quite sophisticated. And we have some great records of Spaniards saying things like, these people are not the same as Native Americans we've been dealing with. They're much more sophisticated, much more skilled at dealing with foreign adversaries. And, many speak English and Spanish, and some even spoke a little French. But so very few Miskito people had been exposed to Christianity or missionaries of any kind in the 18th century. It was almost, they The few missionaries that came were almost exclusively to the Honduran portion in the 18th century, near the largest British enclave, which was around Black River, which is called Palacios today in Honduras. And so that, the Christianity was not really a factor for the Miskito until the 19th century. There was early efforts in the 19th century to reach out to the Miskito, but these efforts kind of failed. Things changed dramatically, though, in the mid 19th century when Moravian missionaries came from the Caribbean and began to work in blue fields, and they had success among the Creole population, who are descendants primarily of enslaved members of British residents who were then free and were basically the power brokers on the East Coast early in the 19th century, Creole people. So they first evangelized among them in urban centers like Bluefields in the mid 19th century. I'm talking about 1849, 1850s. Then they slowly began to reach out to Miskito people, and make a long story short, there was something that the Moravians call a Great Awakening in the 1880s, in which there was kind of a mass conversion movement in which both Creole and Miskito people were seen as speaking in tongues and seeking salvation, and all of these sorts of things that are attributed to a kind of millennial movement. There's no question that official membership of church congregations, Moravian church congregations, grew dramatically, maybe doubling every couple of years until, I would say, by the end of the 19th century, so 2 generations, 50 years, the majority of Miskito people were nominally considered themselves Moravian. I've written about this quite a bit in a book called The Awakening Coast. It's more of an anthology of Moravian missionary writings that's heavily annotated to try to be a little bit more academic with the voices of the Moravians. However, some of the writers that we have, and we'll get to the sources of where I got this in a minute, but some of the writers are actually Creole people or Africans, Afro-descendant people from the Caribbean who learned the Miskito language and translated hymns and ultimately the scripture. And it's quite interesting that people of African descent seem to have the greatest impact in many ways in evangelizing among the Miskito. And they weren't, many of them weren't ordained. They were lay pastors. Some of them did become ordained as well, but some of them lived there basically 40 to 50 years of their adult lives and died, on the Miskito shore. And this basically happened in the sort of last quarter of the 19th century, in which very strong movement for the Moravians in among the Miskito and other indigenous groups that sort of occurred later. But one thing I've argued in my writing is that the Moravian church, in a way, on the one hand, you could think of Christian missionaries as perhaps, because they weren't fond of traditional Miskito culture, especially what they considered their shaman or sukya. These were sort of demonic figures in Moravian writings, who are basically traditional shaman among the Miskito. But one of the things that happened is that I've argued is that, and there's quite a bit of evidence for this, is that the Moravians became sort of modern shaman for the Miskito. And by this, I mean in many ways, they help protect the Miskito culture by standardizing it, by writing it down, by giving it a script, by linking the Miskito to a broader world of other Christians, including, the way the Bible was translated. It's quite fascinating. So like the translators were very sophisticated in using like local words and places for biblical things. So like just one example of this is in Spanish, the cedar tree is called cedro. It was a valuable hardwood that was extracted. It's, used in cigar boxes and things like this, right? So the famous cedars of Lebanon that are described in the Bible are described with the Miskito term for that tree in in the Muskitia. So the Miskito are like, look, we were basically set in biblical times because our trees are in the Bible. They're not reading that critically in the sense that we might do it today. And so the translators did a great job in connecting
Mhm.
biblical story to the Miskito reality and to their terms. And anyway, so one of the things that happened at the end of the 19th century was that the states of Nicaragua and Honduras became more active in seeking to incorporate these regions that they deemed as being sort of colonized by alien forces, meaning both the Miskito themselves as somehow an alien force, but particularly international capital and enterprises. So one of the things the Miskito education system and church structure did for the Miskito is it gave them a kind of cultural center that they could use to push back against particularly in the Nicaraguan case, Nicaraguan efforts to incorporate them into basically Hispanic culture. They tried to make Spanish the official language. They wanted more Catholic evangelists or Catholic churches to be allowed out there. And now there are many denominations out on the coast. Other Protestant sects, which the Moravians are, but also Catholic as well. And I would say today, most Miskito would identify as being Christian, but they're not necessarily Moravian associated anymore. But the Moravians played a big role in, I would say, helping the Miskito survive the modernist onslaught of the late 19th, 20th century, including very rapid social, economic, and political changes. Gold was discovered at the end of the 19th century. American capital flowed in. Railroads were being built. It was tumultuous time like the
Mhm.
United States in the West. And, a lot of native peoples there lost a lot of what they had culturally before. And I would say that happened a bit, of course, in Nicaragua and in Honduras as well. But I would say the Moravian Church played a big role in actually helping the Miskito maintain cultural traditions in a way that, might not have happened to the same extent had they not come.
No, absolutely. And then we'll just continue with in terms of the archival sources.
Yeah.
What sources and where did you rely on for your research for this?
Yeah. Well, you mentioned like primary, so for the 18th and earlier periods, it's basically all colonial records. And these are in Britain,
Mhm.
what's called the National Archive at Kew Garden, very big repository. But there's other repositories throughout the United Kingdom. In Scotland, there's quite a bit of records. Some of the settlers were Scottish. There's a great record in an estate record by an Isle of Man colonist. They're called Manx people after the cat came from there, I guess, the Manx cat, the ones without the tails. And Scotland is Scotland and London are the big sources. The Society for Propagation of the Gospel
Mhm.
in foreign parts is in London as well. They have some records. And then, of course, there's records throughout the Spanish Empire as well. So in Seville, the big archive it's called the Archivo General de las Indias. AGI, the Archive of the Indies, is a big source. There's other archives in Spain as well, like Simancas, that
Mhm.
has some records. And then there's some regional locations. Jamaica has many things. Bogota, Colombia has many things. Costa Rica has some things. Surprisingly, Nicaragua has very little, especially with anything related to the coast before the 19th century. Where there's probably the best archive that's been the least explored. Well, let me put it this way, the least explored, still very good archive is in Guatemala City. It's called the Central American Archive in English. It's in Guatemala City. A lot of what they have is unique in that it's, a lot people copied their handwritten letters, and so copies are dispersed around many places. And so many things it was assumed were always in Seville or in Spain that Hispanic writers were corresponding about. But there's a lot of unique things in the Guatemalan archive. But the Moravian materials in particular are in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Herrnhut, Germany, and in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, particularly after the Germans were expelled from Central America during World War I. So that kind of ends the Herrnhut archives relationship with the coast, as well as the Bethlehem relationship to the coast as well. Things begin to shift to Winston-Salem at that time, although the missionaries were early on, they were German or, Prussian. Many were English as well, but many were German speaking, which is an interesting overlay
Yeah.
upon things, although you don't see like, evidence of the German language having been influenced compared to, English, for example, on the Miskito language or even Spanish.
No, absolutely. And then it just goes to show what you said is that records are going to be all over. They're not going to be in one place that you may think that they should be, but they could be in many different locations. So,
Yes. And it's one of the interesting, the United States is another source for records, but most of these are all like military records or copies of British documents before our own independence from Britain. So
mm,
some generals were active in corresponding with the foreign ministry who were involved in Caribbean warfare. And some of those warfares took them, you know, to Central America. Lord Nelson, for example, was almost killed on the Rio San Juan, and he definitely knew several Miskito people. This has been a big, you know, people who've written about the biography of Nelson, Horatio Nelson, have, mentioned that
mhm.
he served as a corporal, young corporal on the Rio San Juan, but they forget that he was actually influenced quite a bit by the Miskito, I imagine. Maybe even saved by them in terms of removing his, you know, hallucinating body out to the coast and then back to Jamaica. He was close to on his deathbed, I would say, with
Yeah,
fever, which could have been anything in the day.
exactly. And then, of course, we're going back again to the colonial powers, particularly British and Spanish, and how they shaped the Mosquito movements through the Caribbean and ultimately, of course, shaped their presence in Central America. Could you speak a little
Yeah.
bit more about that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, the British basically, to summarize a great deal of things, used them or tried to use them as mercenaries. They tried to get them to guide them up rivers they were excellent aquatic boatmen. And this is every person who ever
Mm,
interacted with a Mosquito man, for the most part, basically called them, superlative, navigators, boatmen. They could stand in boats that other people couldn't. They would just fall out of while they were sitting. I mean, in many ways, they needed them for this skill above all else. They could move keep powder dry, crossing over breakers, going in or out of the sea to the coast, going up rivers in rainstorms, keeping food and gunpowder dry. And the Miskito were basically used or attempted to be used as mercenaries by the British, mostly for contraband trade, for attacking Spanish locations, particularly during times of Anglo-Spanish conflict, which were numerous in the 18th century. And the Miskito didn't see them as mercenaries at all. They saw themselves as being basically using the British to advance their own agenda. And, the British paid them in what they called presents, but what the Miskito saw basically as tribute to be able to remain amongst them and to, take advantage of their skills. And in many ways, one person's gift is another person's tribute, for sure. And they received a lot of symbolic things that became very important to Miskito culture, including military uniforms, hats, gorgets, amulets, and all kinds of trappings of titles and swords, silver-headed canes, and things like this. And there's a lot of references to how the Miskito used canes as emblems of authority to command those below them to carry out certain tasks, like providing them with some goods or, collecting a debt or things like this. One of the other things the Miskito did is they captured many surrounding Indian peoples and enslaved them, either among themselves, which I don't think was the usual goal, but more likely they sold them to the British, and many enslaved Native Americans. And during times of war, people of mixed race from the Spanish Empire as well, including African peoples, would be basically sold into the British network of slave trading throughout the Caribbean, including Jamaica, but some ended up in South Carolina and places like this, and presumably elsewhere. These aren't the Miskito themselves, but the Miskito participated in this trade. And they also, captured and sold people to pay off debts that the British tried to indebit the Miskito by advancing them goods and advancing them weapons, shot, powder, sails, nets, things like this that they needed and wanted. And in order to repay this, sometimes they found themselves what they called, forced to capture and enslave surrounding native peoples. But during times of war, they definitely complained if they weren't able to take captives, because they saw this as the way, why else would they fight for the British if they couldn't get captives? I mean, didn't make any sense from their point of view. So, but there was also toward the late 18th century a kind of movement to curtail Miskito slaving of the surrounding native peoples by the British in particular, to better incorporate those surrounding native peoples into the British commercial political enterprises. But it was a little they were offering little in exchange for this. For the Miskito point of view, it's like they encouraged slaving for 200 years and then they wanted to go cold turkey as some sort of modernist ploy. But the Miskito were like, wait a minute, but this is a livelihood practice for us, and that, you've encouraged this before. What's changed? And this created some factional differences among the Miskito as well, and created more conflict among the Sambo and Tawira, kind of pushing the Tawira Miskito a little bit closer to the Spaniards in some respects, and the Sambo more closely to British interests in the late colonial period as well. But There's other cases of where the Miskito basically received tribute from the Spaniards, particularly in places like Costa Rica and what is today Panama in the Bocas del Toro region, which is on the border between Costa Rica and Panama on the Caribbean side. And, they would collect tribute as basically to not pillage and not enslave people or attack legitimate Spanish commerce like cacao production for
Mhm.
chocolate. And that was a lucrative industry as well for the Miskito.
Absolutely. And then, of course, I guess, between the two groups, you said that, the Samba and is it the Tawira groups? Could you explain in terms of, I guess, how that geographical distribution happened, as well as, were there any colonial influences to that distribution of where they live, so to speak?
Yeah, it's kind of the $1 million question, and there's quite a bit of debate about this among specialists. But I think there's no question that there's a broad geographic divide between the Sambo in the north and the
Mm,
Tawida in the southern portions. There were basically four Miskito leaders who had titles which were exactly admiral, governor, general, and king, with the king being sort of nominally at the head, mostly because he had a title that both the English and Spanish could recognize as being above an admiral or a general. But I don't think the Miskito necessarily saw it that way. And there's no question that the general, Miskito general, often saw himself as a co equal to the king. Beginning in the early 18th century, those two men were always Sambo Miskito. And the beginning in the 18th century, the governor and admiral were always Tawira Miskito, or what was just simply called in the historical record Miskito Indians, as opposed to Miskito Sambo. And those, the general and the admiral, were located in the two precincts or districts that were in Nicaragua, south of Sandy Bay area, which
mm,
is in northeastern Nicaragua, which was the king's domain, and then the general was in what is today northeastern Honduras. So there was this north-south divide, and that sort of structured things. Now, did the did colonial interactions contribute to that distinction? Probably. How it played out, it's not clear. I think the bigger question is, to what extent did 18th century ideas of race, which are not the same as what we use today to think about it, I don't think, played a role. And I think the fact that, people of African descent could be enslaved, whereas native peoples, at least in the British Empire, could also be enslaved, it played a role. But I think there are some passages in which Miskito people are being quoted in colonial records by European writers as, as basically indicating that some racial concepts were used to distinguish the Zambo from the Tawida. I don't think that was the biggest difference to them. Internally, the difference was more about political interests and control of the presence and the tribute stream, and control of different smuggling networks, and what could be acquired from trade with Spaniards, or Spaniards who were basically smuggling. They weren't supposed to be trading outside of, imperial official channels. And this is why I think the Tawira became more closely associated with the Spanish of Costa Rica and what is today Panama, and the Sambo became more closely associated with the Spaniards of of Honduras, for
mhm,
example.
mhm.
And So there were some racialized differences, but I think the historical record shows that there were definitely some people of mixed ancestry who lived among the Tawira, just as there were people who outsiders might describe as Miskito Indian who lived in the Sambo realm as well. It's more about the titled figures were always Sambo or Tawira, two of each. And it's thought that the the governor, the Tawira governor, and the Sambo king were kind of co-equal heads of their respective subgroups of Miskito. But there's time periods where I would say the Sambo general was equally as powerful as the king or the governor. And there's also some transportation issues. This is a very large area, and so there's some instances where the British, for example, tried to call together all the Miskito leaders, but the general didn't make it. And there would be statements like, he found it inconvenient to come at this time. And, it was much harder for him to get to, let's say, Bluefields or something like this. And they'll say something like, his presence was immaterial anyway. And it's kind of indicating that, he's in his own realm, which makes sense if you look at what happened later. So in the mid 19th century, the general essentially ceded his territory to the new Central American Republic of Honduras. And this is the sort of beginning of the beginning of the end of a kind of binational Miskito heartland where the Miskitia stretched from Honduras to Nicaragua. In the 19th century, that kind of broke down as national borders became more significant. The Miskito in Honduras began interacting with a northern sphere of people rather than as they had in the past. For example, turtling down in Costa Rica. The migration of the turtle, the green sea turtle, I haven't mentioned this yet, but plays a big role in why the Miskito were in Costa Rica and Panama in the very beginning was they were hunting the green sea turtle or eventually the hawksbill sea turtle, which was a big commercial commodity in the 18th century.
No, absolutely. And, Professor Offen, in regards to your research, how did race influence the distinctions between the Sambo and the Tawira Miskito? Like these labels, because I know you mentioned the physical description, but how did race influence, if there was at all?
I would say it influenced in a big way, but primarily in the way that external actors viewed race themselves. So they were racist for the most part in the sense that they saw race as an important marker of cultural difference, of human difference. The idea that someone of African descent could be enslaved, for example, is just, that had to shape the way then that they interacted with the Miskito and the way in which the Miskito picked up nonverbal cues in the way they saw how the British and the Spanish interacted with their African descended subjects and or how they treated both free and enslaved people of African descent. So it had to play a role in how the Miskitos saw race, but I think as a category among themselves, without these external conditions that structured these ideas of race for them, I don't think they would have identified someone who's more Afro descended than native descended as being significantly different in some way. And part of that is because of the long, very long interaction of the people who became identified as Miskito with African peoples on their own, right? So outside of colonial context, one of the things I'm working on right now is trying to understand more about the very first African peoples who arrived on the coast. They were basically self-liberated escapees from Spanish mines. And we're talking about in the mid 16th century. So way before the Miskito people appear with that name in the colonial records. They were there, but they weren't going by that name. Miskito speaking people were there. It's just nobody called them Miskito. They were other names were used. So I think that they have a much longer interaction with African peoples and integrating them into their society than the the sort of more large scale arrival of Africans with the slave ships, whether it was a capsize or whether the Dutch set them down on the shore. This would have been in 1636, so approximately 100 years after the first Africans arrived independently on the shore, but in a more trickle in fashion, ones and twos and maybe three and fours, but not 250 or some number along those lines. And by the way, those people who the 250 or so would have been young people, in some cases children. There's some evidence that the Puritans, for example, didn't take the children, and they were the ones that were set down on the coast. And I think all people will be interested to hear this. There's some evidence that when the Spanish retook Providence Island in 1641, that many Africans there likely escaped to the Miskito shore, and in part because they knew that their offspring were there. And this is probably one of the most interesting but buried, in part because we just don't have enough evidence to make it an exciting story. But the evidence points to the fact that they were seeking out the Miskito coast because they knew, I don't want to say their children, but basically people who were on the boat with them were on the shore, and they knew this, and they wanted to get there. And, there's evidence for that. So, how that played a role in, shaping later racialized concepts among the Miskito, it's kind of an open question. But I think more importantly than ideas of race, either in the 18th or 19th century, where things get really, racialized on the coast. And I mean, like Jim Crow laws come to the coast in the 20th century with the American companies, basically apartheid systems where Black people couldn't go to certain areas. And the Miskito always felt like this didn't apply to them, regardless of how they looked, because, they were native peoples. They have a mixed ancestry, but they're Native Americans, they're native peoples, they're indigenous peoples. So the law is applying to Blacks.
Someone that doesn't describe them.
Yeah. But there are, Miskito who look primarily of African descent, but they speak Miskito, they identify as Miskito, they are Miskito in every sense, and they're indigenous to Central America. Yeah, so I think racial ideas, Western ideas of racial differences were kind of imposed on the Miskito. And I'm not saying they didn't absorb some of that, but how it played out amongst themselves is fascinating to see. You really don't see, even today, a broad, biases, or you don't see too much, they don't see differences in the way that white people would, for example, on the coast. And I should say the way white people did, even, into the present. They just don't see that. They see Miskito markers first and everything else second.
And then going into now language with what the Miskitos speak. Was there one, I guess, language or dialect, or were there, major differences between the two groups?
This is also a good question. So linguists who've looked at the Miskito language, there was an assumption, I think, before modern linguistic studies that the Miskito language was a dialect or closely related to other indigenous languages like the Mayagna language in particular. But modern linguists, and by modern I mean from the late 20th century, have basically said that the Miskito language separated from the Mayagna probably 400 years before the Spaniards even arrived. So it was a distinct language already, in 1492. And there are dialects today within the Miskito language that are basically regional based, not so much racialized in any way. I don't think there is, but now Honduran Miskito would be spoken a little different, but it's mostly about which foreign influences have shaped their language in a way that a place in Nicaragua wouldn't have been influenced by. And so it's I think there are regional dialects. I think most people learning Miskito as an outsider wouldn't even pick this up, but you do hear Miskito people talking about, certain, pronunciations that are different, or certain word choices. But it's I don't think the dialect differences, for example, is different as British or American English.
Mhm.
It's more like, New York English versus California English, or New York English versus Texas English. That would be my take on that. But yeah, the Miskito language it's very, very vibrant and very able to incorporate foreign loan words, and there are some words that are the same but the grammatical structure is very different than the nearest Native American language, which is Mayagna, sometimes called Sumu, which is kind of a larger language family. And linguists basically say these languages are traced to a Macro-Chibcha language family, which originated, maybe 1,000 years ago from northwestern Colombia, suggesting that the people along the Caribbean coast of Central America came from northwestern South America. There's some pushback against those kinds of theories, but the linguistic connection between Miskito, for example, and some earlier other languages in the Macro-Chibcha family are pretty removed. However, there's no question that the Miskito language is very different than languages of Western or Northern Central America or Mexico, like the Mayan languages, for example. There's no connection at all between those languages, even though they were pretty close to each other in many respects, and probably some trade contacts, if nothing else, in the early days.
No, and then of course, how has the Mosquito preserved their cultural heritage and of course their traditions present day?
Yeah, I would say to the extent that they have, and there's a lot that's been eroded, of course,
Of course.
to the extent that they have, there's been some revitalization efforts. One of the strengths of the Sandinista, the first Sandinista revolution in the 80s. I mean, although they were in conflict with the Miskito, and then that's when the Miskito became allies of the United States effort to overthrow the Sandinistas. But one thing the Miskito did, particularly toward the end after the peace agreement with the Miskito in 1987, is they began teaching native peoples in their native languages, and a lot of outside organizations and modern linguistic partnerships emerged in which, primers of, grammatical things. So like first graders and second graders in Mayagna or in Miskito or in Rama could learn their own languages first in a grammatical textbook sort of way. But other linguistic studies, for example, in Corn Island by a colleague of mine, Amanda Minks, has shown that children code switch between English, Spanish, and Miskito as if these languages are all together. Even though they're three separate languages and they know this, they just mix them up in such a way that they're basically trilingual, but also, I don't know if it would be considered a new language. I think just code switching is the way to go with that, how to classify that. But there is a lot of code switching going on. So Miskito will speak Miskito in the house and, easily Spanish at work and maybe some English expressions when they're speaking to Creole people or things like this. But how they've preserved their traditions, I would say, by being flexible, by making new traditions, by modifying older traditions, by bringing them into official institutions like the church that originally set out to squash indigenous traditions, but ended up being, I don't want to say they're protectors, but being a repository of where those traditions could reside and be modified in a way that didn't push too much against Christianity, but on the other hand, allowed more traditional beliefs to play out. So it wouldn't be uncommon for even a Moravian pastor, for example, and I've had experience with this, talking about things that maybe a modern secular person or even a Christian from the West might see as being superstitious or, incompatible with Christianity, let's just say, have no problem having a traditional belief or what I would call a traditional belief, but also being, not just a Christian, but being a pastor, so being educated in Christianity to propagate it as well, but still holding many traditional beliefs regarding, for example, spirit beings that reside in the landscape. There's just a whole world of spirit beings in traditional Miskito society. Obviously, some of these have eroded today, but as recently as the 90s and early 21st century, I would say definitely not gone. And but how they combine and recombine with Christianity in particular, but also science learning and things like this. But there are things that, aren't explained easily by those other things. And Miskito explanations or traditional beliefs help explain or help bridge the gap between what's being taught and official and what they're experiencing where they live.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, Professor, often as we come to a close, what are your, I guess, your final thoughts would you like the listeners to take away about the Miskito and their history and, of course, their resilience?
Yeah, thank you for giving me that chance. Basically, I would say that the Miskito people, it was during the 18th century and late 17th century, it was called the Miskito Kingdom, where they ruled an autonomous political unit. I would say it's the most important Afro-Amerindian political unit in the Americas. Compared to some of the other well-known Afro-descendant iconic autonomous places like Palmeiras in Brazil, which, yes, that was a special, maroon community that survived 100 years independent of colonial rule. But it was eventually taken over by the Portuguese. In the Miskito case, that never happened.
Mhm.
They remained independent. And even during the Sandinista revolution, in Nicaragua's case, 2 autonomous regions were created. And today they're still fighting for their basically autonomy from centralized government control. I don't know if that's a good strategy for them, but it's not
Yeah.
for me to say. But nevertheless, I would say, they were independent in the 17th century, 18th century. They saw their independence erode in the 19th and 20th century, but they never lost it. And I'd say it was the most important, Afro-Amerindian independent political entity in the Americas, bar none. And maybe not the most influential in terms of symbolic influence affecting other Afro or Amerindian peoples, but in terms of what it meant for Central America and what it meant for themselves and some of the larger political and historical events that they played a part of is just totally underrated and ignored. And so I think specialists and people who
Mhm.
follow it understand this, but I'd say the majority of people don't.
Yeah. No, no, thank you so much for your time, for coming on, Professor Offen, just to be able to discuss this because as I said before we started recording, is that this isn't an area that's often talked about or discussed. And in order to know or to even get to researching within this area, it's good to know the history of where things are because you mentioned so many things that kind of overlap other things that are still going on and that were still taking place during that time frame period, during this whole entire Caribbean era. So
Yeah.
I will definitely be posting your book, the things that you've mentioned in here as additional links if people want to further look into and to dive into. So thank you again for your time and I definitely appreciate you coming on to the podcast. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you. Nice to speak with you.
Perfect.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.